Nova is a good Warframe, and she was a good Warframe before DE devoted an entire 5,726 words to, quote-unquote, a light rework. Whatever they want to call it, I don't care, because when I throw on my Nova, and then I do that, or I do that, well, Jesus Christ. Yeah, this is gonna be a good one, guys. Two setups here for y'all today, one you're probably a bit more familiar with, and one that I personally just found out about, and is what really pushed me to make this video. Like the vault setup in my prior video, it's easily one of the coolest builds I have ever made in a long time. Before all that though, what exactly was this light rework? Well, for the uninitiated, I got you. Nova's passive used to be utter, but now it easily sits among the top in terms of utility. Enemies killed by Nova while either slowed or sped up will drop a health or energy orb corresponding to the debuff applied, which can come from any source, whether it be the cold status or Equinox's rest and rage, and obviously molecular prime. This pretty much solves energy economy on her with the inclusion of equilibrium for slow builds, or in other cases just generating such an absurd amount of energy that the game bugs out. Look at that. Null Star being the focus of our first build and Molecular Prime being that of the second, I think it is more appropriate to cover those abilities when we get to them, so let's get Antimatter drop and Wormhole out of the way first. Antimatter drop was changed pretty significantly, and while some people will see it as an overall nerf, I for one think the ability is in a much better spot. Casting will now create an orb in front of you that follows your reticle, lasting indefinitely until making contact with a surface or an enemy. This orb absorbs everything shot into it, including those from enemies, and allows it to be charged with damage. It will only take up to 5 shots to fully do this, not counting multi-shot, and is capped out at 25,000 damage. If you now recast the ability, it will fly very quickly towards wherever your reticle is placed and explode for a base 200 damage plus the 25,000 absorbed damage, which is then multiplied by 8 at base strength. This does scale, mind you. Being dealt as blast damage, it also force procs to status and really just causes everything to explode for a lot of damage. While good in its own right, it doesn't really have a place in either of our two setups for today, and the same goes for Wormhole. After they removed the interaction where you could shoot a Nautilus through the portal and back into itself endlessly, which was very fun, though admittedly broken, this ability is again relegated to pure movement stuff, but it is still fun, so I do prefer to keep it over Antimatter drop. Now for the good stuff though. Build 1 is focused entirely around buffing the absolute hell out of Null Stars to make them do this. There's a lot going into this one, so if you want something a little simpler, then definitely stick around for build 2. But if you're trying to have people go, yo, what is that setup? Keep watching. Expending 25 energy to cast, doing so will spawn 12 antimatter particles around Nova. These will orbit her until enemies are within range, where they will then launch themselves one by one per second at enemies to deal 200 blast damage and force proc to status. While they are still orbiting Nova, they provide her with a 5% damage reduction per, this capping out at 90%, and this does now give DR to HP and shields too. Not really sure why it never did, but it's like that now, so good. By itself though, this ability doesn't do anything in terms of damage, and is where its revamped augment of Neutron Star comes into play. Neutron Star causes particles to deal 240 heat damage on addition of the innate blast, and force to status on the initial target and those within 8 meters. Interestingly, and I am actually not sure if this is a bug or not, it will cause 2 blasts to be applied per hit and the AoE to apply 1 of either. We'll see if that stays for a while. Regardless, recasting while it is active will now cause particles to seek out enemies at a doubled range, which is good for obvious nuking reasons. Here is where things get even weirder though. Null Star is coded as a weapon on the back end, which allows it to be buffed by universal damage increases other than strength, i.e. Eclipse, Arcane Arachne, Vigorous Swap, or in our case, Nourish. Nourish applies viral damage to your weapons, and when used with Null Star, surprisingly, does exactly that too. By applying the buff to each particle, we can increase their damage very well and also adjust how statuses on them are divvied out. This will allow the ability to now trigger the viral status 2 for a 1 stack 100% damage increase and a 10 stack 325% damage increase. In practice, casting now still forces a heat proc, but because Nourish is added into the elemental mixing with Blast, both of them are competing to trigger with one another. More on that later. As mentioned before though, there are more buffs we can add in here, that being a 150% multiplicative damage bonus from Arcane Arachne, and even the ability to crit. First with Arachne, it is triggered by performing a wall latch, which if you do not want to do, I get it, but where its damage is additive to things like Serration on weapons, for certain abilities which are listed here, it will multiply their damage, and Null Star just happens to be one of them. Now, something you probably didn't know is that Null Star can crit, but its base stats are a 0% critical chance and a 1x multiplier. So we must add flat sources of both to increase our damage here. And this is going to be done through Arcane Avenger and Tenacious Bond. Avenger requires damage to be dealt to you, something that is omnipresent on Steel Path to trigger a 21% chance for a 45% flat critical chance buff to be added universally to our loadout, Null Star included. Now for that base 1x multiplier, the only source of raw critical damage we can add here is from Tenacious Bond on a companion, which is going to be Nautilus for another reason I will tell you in just a second. Tenacious gives a flat 1.2x more critical damage, bringing Null Star to 45% critical chance and 2.2x damage, which is just very good for an ability. Nautilus though is super important here because it provides something that this build really wants, which is grouping. Why does this build want that? Well, it's due to something called quadratic scaling. What is quadratic scaling? Well, to put it simply, it's a term used for when putting more of something together results in more damage, more of something in our case being enemies. Because the damage is dealt through blast, if we group up enemies, they will all trigger these explosions on top of one another. And due to the nature of how AoE attacks work, this will increase our damage significantly higher than previously obtainable. I actually really like the example that Malorth gave in a reply to a comment on his video, where he also talked about this build. You hit one guy, you deal 1 damage. You hit 2 guys, you deal 4 damage. You hit 3, you deal 9, and so on. Definitely go check out his channel if you haven't yet. The only remaining ability synergy here is from Molecular Prime, which now on holdcast or tapping if inverted in these settings right here, can speed up enemies and also apply a 2x universal damage multiplier to them. Speeding up enemies is absolutely the best choice for this build because you want them all to be grouped together as much as possible for that sweet quadratic scaling. It is definitely the best way to increase damage here, and speed multipliers like this one make Cordon's pull actually far more effective due to the way that it functions. With all of that covered, let's talk mods. We really want as much of every stat as we can besides efficiency here, that being taken care of entirely by Nourish and the fact that sped up enemies drop energy orbs, which are then multiplied by it. With that said, 235 range from overextended and stretch, duration at 183 for over 30 seconds on Nourish, and a 60 meter non-line of sight radius on Molecular Prime, this also making Null Star grant 21 particles to Nova. The augment, obviously, and then strength-wise, Blind Rage and Umbral Intensify. Survivability here is going to come from catalyzing shields with Brief Respite and 2 auger mods, which are slotted on our secondary. These will make a single cast of Null Star refill more than enough shields to provide another 1.33 second gate on break. Arcane wise, Avenger and Arachne as stated, though you can swap Arachne for Molt Augmented if you don't want to wall latch every 30 seconds, I get it. For Nautilus, we want to spam Cordon as much as possible and satisfy the 50% crit chance requirement of Tenacious. For the first, just having Manifold Bond equipped will do. We get the 3 statuses needed to lower ability cooldowns from Null Star innately due to it triggering Heat, Blast, and Viral, so that is taken care of already. And then Burst Laser Prime allows us to meet the threshold for Tenacious Bond with Prime Pistol Gambit equipped, and also get a decent status spreader for Gas on Electric if combined with Duplex Bond, though it isn't really all that needed. Just make sure you've got Assault Mode on so it fires at enemies, and you are all set. The only further recommendation I have here is to use any secondary you want with the Fortifier Arcane for free Overguard, which removes the need for Prime Sure-Footed. Though, if you have the Grimoire, it's good for both that and 60% more ability strength. So to recap, you just cast Molecular Prime, then Nourish, and then you spam Null Star and it will do all of the work for you. Just remember to trigger Arachne every 30 seconds and you are set. This build does prefer a more stationary playstyle, which from some of this background gameplay you see I don't do very well because I have pseudo ADHD and can't stand in the same place for a long time, but the grouping from Cordon really makes camping that much better here. So Null Star nuking, it's pretty damn good, but what about Molecular Prime nuking? It is honestly just as powerful, and you've probably seen what I'm about to talk about, because yeah, it's just that good. Molecular Prime is an interesting ability that has a lot going on. For starters, the radius that it covers scales off not range but duration. This is due to the wave having the innate function of expanding its own radius by 5 meters per second that it is active, which means that a longer duration obviously allows it to expand for even longer and cover a bigger area. Enemies who are encapsulated by this wave will be hit with the aforementioned 100% damage vulnerability debuff, and depending on the version cast, be either slowed or sped up. The slow or speed has a cap of 75% in either direction at 150 strength, but more importantly, enemies who are killed under these effects will detonate upon death and deal 800 blast damage with a 20% status chance and a scaling 10 meter range. This does have a 60% linear fall off. This explosion has some very unique properties though, where it will inherit the traits of whatever weapon is used to start the initial explosion shape. Simply, Killing enemies with a melee will make the game consider the explosions as melee damage and allow you to carry over things like Amalgam Argonac Metal Auger if a dagger with said mod is used, and don't get me wrong, stuff like that is very powerful, but the best possible application of this tech is with certain Incarnate weapons, specifically those with the Tree 4 perk of Devouring Attrition. Devouring Attrition is a perk present on Fenmore, Felarx, and Latum, granting them a 50% chance on non-critical hit to get a plus 2000% multiplicative damage boost. When used with Nova, killing primed enemies will have them taxi the straight over to the explosion and make it deal a lot of damage. The best weapon for this in my opinion has to be Fenmore. I just made a video talking about how strong this weapon is following the Blast rework, and it really only gets better when used with Nova Inherit. Because the chain here is purely dependent on getting that initial kill, building our Fenmore purely for raw damage is best here. My Fenmore's polarities are a little messed up, but just replace the electric 60/60 for the 90% raw elemental damage. Evolutions wise, here is what I'm using. This is pretty bog standard for a Fenmore setup these days, but the build on Nova is a bit different than the prior, focusing more on strength and foregoing the negative 60% from overextended to scale both molecular prime and our helmet ability of choice, Pillage. Pillage gives us all the survivability we would ever need, especially with the 90% DR obtained from Null Star and Shield's own innate 50% DR. It also has the benefit of an on-cast status cleanse, and with this setup, will strip away 99% of enemy armor once multi-augmented has fully stacked. If that one last percent of armor really matters that much to you, feel free to open up her Exilus and put in Power Drift, but you might need to form her one more time. Besides that, Multi-Efficiency is another 36% duration for having shields up, which Pillage takes care of. Focus School for either one is irrelevant, use whatever you want, same with your melee. Kratos for the movement speed win. And I believe that just about, no, actually, that really does do it for Nova. This is practically a perfected episode. Actually, yeah, this is Nova perfected. What am I talking about? I wasn't expecting to do these back to back with the vault and then this, especially because this is a much longer video than normal. But you know what? Whatever. I hope you all enjoyed this one. Really wanted to go all out for her, and I think I did that quite well. A huge shout out to my patrons and YouTube members for sticking with me after all this time. If you want to get content like this video early, which they did, check out the links in the description. It'll only run you $5 a month, but it is so appreciated. Y'all the best. I'll see y'all something. Oh my god, chat, I'm losing it. I'll see y'all soon for something. I actually finished my content list since Kome dropped in 2 weeks, which is much quicker than I was anticipating, so recommend me some stuff to do in the comments, please. Anyways, stay safe, y'all. I'll see you soon. Peace.